The German General Staff had studied American military capabilities for decades, analyzing industrial output statistics, observing National Guard exercises, and reading American military journals with the same thoroughness they applied to every potential adversary. Their conclusion, shared by virtually every European military establishment, was that America possessed enormous latent industrial capacity but lacked military seriousness. That Americans were soft, individualistic, and undisciplined compared to European soldiers shaped by centuries of martial tradition. The United States Army in 1941 numbered barely 200,000 men, equipped with obsolete weapons, and led by officers whose most recent combat experience dated to the First World War. Germany had crushed Poland in weeks, France in 6 weeks, and seemed poised to defeat the Soviet Union before winter. When America entered the war following Pearl Harbor, German military planners added this development to their calculations and concluded it changed little. America would require years to mobilize, train, and deploy forces across the Atlantic, and by then the war in Europe would be decided. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong. But the moment of realization came not gradually but suddenly, on specific dates when German forces encountered American military operations that bore no resemblance to their expectations and revealed that they were fighting an entirely different kind of enemy than they had imagined. The first inklings of American difference appeared not on battlefields, but in intelligence reports about industrial production that German analysts initially dismissed as propaganda or statistical errors. American shipyards were reportedly producing Liberty cargo ships at impossible rates, launching vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. American aircraft factories claimed production numbers that exceeded Germany's entire annual output in single months. American tank production figures seemed fantastical, implying assembly line methods that treated armored fighting vehicles like automobiles. These numbers were checked, rechecked, and confirmed through multiple intelligence sources. Yet they still seemed incredible to German planners accustomed to European industrial scales. Germany had the most advanced industrial economy in Europe, had mobilized that economy totally for war production, and was achieving output rates that had surprised even optimistic German projections. Yet American production figures suggested that the United States was outproducing Germany by factors of 3, 4, or 5 to 1 in critical categories while simultaneously supplying enormous quantities of material to Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. The mathematical implications were disturbing but still seemed manageable. In early 1943, American forces in North Africa were learning their trade through defeats at Kasserine Pass and other early engagements, demonstrating inexperience and tactical clumsiness that confirmed German assumptions about American military quality. German veterans of the Eastern Front, where they faced Soviet forces that accepted horrific casualties while grinding forward through sheer numerical superiority, viewed Americans as a lesser threat, better equipped than Russians, but lacking their fanatical determination. The assessment was that American material superiority would be offset by German tactical excellence, superior training, better leadership, and the defensive advantages of prepared positions. This comfortable assumption began cracking during the Sicily and Italy campaigns, where American forces demonstrated a disturbing ability to learn from defeats, adapt tactics rapidly, and employ firepower with a lavishness that German units could only dream about. The true revelation came with the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. Though not immediately at the beaches, where German defenders initially inflicted significant casualties on landing forces, the revelation came in the days and weeks following the initial landings as German commanders confronted the reality of what America had deployed across the Atlantic and how fundamentally different American military operations were from anything in European experience. The scale of the invasion fleet itself was staggering. Thousands of ships ranging from battleships to landing craft assembled in Britain and launched across the Channel in an operation that required logistical coordination exceeding anything previously attempted in military history. But scale alone might have been explicable through America's industrial capacity. What shocked German commanders was the systematic application of that industrial capacity to solve military problems in ways that seemed almost wasteful, yet proved devastatingly effective. American forces in Normandy operated under assumptions that would have seemed insane to German logistics officers. Artillery ammunition was fired not in carefully rationed amounts, but in barrages that consumed more shells in hours than German divisions received in weeks. When American infantry encountered resistance, they called for artillery support, air support, tank support, and naval gunfire if available, then waited while overwhelming firepower reduced enemy positions before advancing. This approach struck German observers as cowardly, or at least excessively cautious, the behavior of troops who lacked confidence in their infantry skills and compensated with firepower. Yet it was also undeniably effective, allowing American forces to advance while taking fewer casualties than comparable German operations, grinding forward through the hedgerows of Normandy slowly but inexorably, while German defenders exhausted their limited ammunition stocks and received minimal replacements. The contrast in supply philosophies revealed fundamental differences in how American and German militaries approached warfare. German logistics operated on carefully calculated sufficiency, determining minimum necessary supplies for operations and distributing them efficiently to maximize combat power while minimizing waste. This system worked brilliantly when supply lines functioned properly and front lines remained relatively stable. American logistics operated on abundance and redundancy, stockpiling vast quantities of supplies at every level, accepting significant waste as preferable to any possibility of shortage, and treating supply flow as something to be maximized rather than optimized. German quartermasters looked at American supply dumps with disbelief, seeing mountains of equipment, ammunition, fuel, and supplies that seemed to violate every principle of efficient military logistics. Yet this approach meant American units almost never faced shortages, could operate at full intensity indefinitely, and could afford tactical approaches that required enormous material consumption. The mechanization difference was equally stark and perhaps even more significant. The German army in 1944 still moved primarily on foot and by horse-drawn transport, with only elite divisions fully motorized and even those dependent on captured vehicles and scarce fuel. The entire German army in the West possessed perhaps 2,000 operational tanks and assault guns, carefully husbanded and deployed in critical sectors. American forces in France by late summer 1944 had deployed over 10,000 tanks, with more arriving continuously. Every combat unit from division headquarters down to company level was fully motorized with standardized vehicles. When American divisions needed to move, they loaded into trucks and drove. When German divisions needed to move, they marched on foot for days, arrived exhausted, and required rest before entering combat. This mobility differential meant Americans could concentrate forces faster, exploit breakthroughs more rapidly, and sustain operational tempo that German forces could not match. The breaking point where German commanders fully understood what they faced came during Operation Cobra in late July 1944. The American breakout from Normandy that shattered German defensive lines and transformed the campaign from a traditional slugging match to mobile warfare. American forces concentrated overwhelming force at a narrow point, employed saturation bombing by thousands of aircraft, then poured through the gap with armored divisions that advanced not cautiously, but at maximum speed, bypassing resistance and driving deep into German rear areas. The operation succeeded not through tactical brilliance, but through the application of force at densities that German defenders simply could not withstand. When German forces attempted counterattacks, American fighter-bombers destroyed their columns. When German units tried to establish defensive lines, American artillery plastered their positions. When German commanders attempted to organize coordinated responses, American signals intelligence intercepted their communications and American raids disrupted their headquarters. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding German forces in France, sent increasingly desperate reports to Berlin describing a military situation spiraling beyond control. His forces were being systematically destroyed not through dramatic decisive battles but through continuous attrition that consumed divisions faster than replacements could arrive. Every engagement resulted in net losses for German forces. Even when tactical outcomes were favorable, every retreat required abandoning equipment that could not be recovered. Every defensive line established was eventually overwhelmed by accumulating American firepower regardless of the skill and courage of German defenders. Von Kluge's reports emphasized that the problem was not poor German performance, but rather American capacity to sustain operations at intensity levels that exhausted German forces. His soldiers were fighting well. His officers were tactically competent. His defenses were professionally organized. Yet none of this mattered against an enemy that could simply keep attacking, keep advancing, keep applying pressure until German units collapsed from exhaustion and depletion. The pursuit across France in August 1944 demonstrated American operational capabilities that seemed to violate everything German military doctrine considered possible. American armored divisions advanced hundreds of miles in days, maintaining cohesion and combat effectiveness while operating at the end of supply lines that stretched back to Normandy beaches. The logistics required to sustain this advance were staggering, with the famous Red Ball Express convoy system delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily along dedicated truck routes. German forces attempted to establish defensive positions along successive river lines only to find American forces already across through aggressive reconnaissance and rapid bridging operations. The speed and reach of American operations suggested an army that had somehow escaped the normal constraints of logistics, weather, terrain, and fatigue that limited all military operations throughout history. German intelligence officers analyzing captured American documents discovered operational assumptions that explained much about American capabilities. American planners calculated ammunition requirements at 2 to 3 times the rates that German doctrine considered maximum sustainable consumption. American logistics manuals specified supply stockage levels that German quartermasters would have condemned as wasteful. American maintenance doctrines called for replacing worn equipment rather than repairing it, treating complex military hardware as essentially disposable. American personnel policies rotated combat veterans to training duties and brought fresh troops to frontline units, maintaining unit effectiveness at the cost of breaking up experienced teams. Every American practice seemed to violate German assumptions about efficient military operations. Yet the cumulative effect was an army that operated at sustained intensity levels German forces could achieve only briefly before exhausting supplies and needing operational pauses. The question that tormented German commanders was whether they faced temporary American advantages that German skill could overcome or whether they confronted fundamental disparities that made defeat inevitable regardless of German tactical performance. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recalled to command in the West after von Kluge's death, concluded pessimistically that the latter was true. In his assessment, American material superiority was so overwhelming that German tactical excellence could achieve local successes but could not affect operational outcomes. Every German victory consumed irreplaceable resources while Americans simply brought forward more units from apparently inexhaustible reserves. The Ardennes Offensive in December 1944 represented Germany's last attempt to employ operational art to overcome material disadvantage, gambling on surprise, weather conditions that grounded Allied air power, and the shock effect of concentrated armored attack to split American lines and capture critical supply dumps. The offensive initially succeeded, creating a dangerous bulge in American lines and capturing thousands of prisoners. Yet within days, the operation demonstrated that German assumptions about American vulnerability were wrong. American units surrounded at Bastogne refused to surrender and held their positions despite being outnumbered and cut off. American reinforcements arrived with stunning speed, redirecting entire divisions to converge on the threatened sector within 72 hours. When weather cleared, American air power appeared in overwhelming strength, destroying German columns and interdicting supply lines. Most critically, The offensive consumed Germany's last operational reserves and achieved nothing decisive, while American losses were replaced within weeks and American operational capabilities were barely affected. The contrast between German and American responses to setbacks revealed the deeper differences between the military systems. When German forces suffered defeats, they lacked resources to restore combat power and could only redistribute surviving units to cover gaps in the line. When American forces suffered defeats, replacement systems delivered fresh troops, supply systems delivered replacement equipment, and units were reconstituted to full strength before returning to combat. German tactical success might destroy an American division, but that division would be rebuilt and returned to combat within a month. American tactical success might destroy a German division, and that division was gone permanently. The cumulative effect was a war of attrition that heavily favored the side with greater resources, and America's resource advantage was so vast that the outcome was never seriously in doubt once American industrial mobilization reached full capacity. German soldiers fighting American forces developed bitter respect for their opponents' material advantages while maintaining belief in their own tactical superiority. Captured German after-action reports and soldier letters describe frustration at facing an enemy that could call down artillery barrages or airstrikes whenever seriously challenged, that seemed to possess unlimited ammunition and fuel, and that replaced casualties and losses overnight while German units wasted away. German veterans of the Eastern Front noted that Americans were more cautious than Russians, less willing to accept casualties, but also far better supplied and supported. Fighting Russians meant facing human waves that could be mowed down with proper defensive preparation. Fighting Americans meant facing firepower that could reduce any defensive position given sufficient time and ammunition, both of which Americans seemed to possess in unlimited quantities. The systematic nature of American military operations impressed German professional officers even as it frustrated them. Americans approached combat with the same methodical efficiency they applied to industrial production, reducing warfare to processes that could be standardized, taught, and replicated. American training created competent soldiers quickly through systematic instruction rather than relying on long service and tradition. American logistics employed assembly line thinking to move supplies efficiently. American maintenance used standardized parts and replacement rather than craft repairs. American tactics emphasized coordination and firepower rather than individual initiative. The entire system seemed designed to minimize the importance of individual skill or courage, to create an army that functioned effectively with ordinary people rather than requiring extraordinary soldiers. This offended German military culture, which valued individual excellence and martial virtue. Yet it proved devastatingly effective at generating and sustaining military power. The final months of the war in Europe demonstrated that German forces had no answer to American operational methods beyond fighting skill that prolonged the inevitable but could not prevent it. German commanders understood they were defeated, understood that continued resistance only increased casualties and destruction, yet fought on from professional duty, political pressure, and in some cases genuine belief in Nazi ideology. The contrast between desperate German improvisations and systematic American operations grew ever starker. Germany was fielding children and old men in Volkssturm units armed with Panzerfaust rockets, relying on fanaticism to compensate for lack of training and equipment. America was deploying fresh divisions equipped with the latest weapons, supported by air forces that ruled the skies, backed by logistic systems that ensured every soldier was fed, clothed, armed, and supplied more lavishly than even elite German units. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 exemplified the gulf between German and American military capabilities. Germany defended the Rhine with the desperation of a nation fighting for survival, employing every remaining resource to hold the last major barrier protecting the German heartland. America crossed the Rhine through overwhelming application of force, employing more artillery and supporting barrages than Germany possessed in the entire theater, constructing bridges under fire through engineering operations that would have seemed impossible by European standards, and establishing bridgeheads that German counterattacks could not reduce. Within days, American forces were ranging freely across Western Germany against resistance collapsing from exhaustion rather than any single decisive defeat. The day Germany learned America was different was not one day, but many days, a cascade of realizations as German commanders encountered American military capabilities that exceeded their assumptions and eventually their comprehension. It was intelligence officers reading production statistics that seemed impossible. It was logistics officers examining captured supply dumps that contained more material than entire German armies possessed. It was frontline commanders watching American firepower reduce defensive positions that should have held for days. It was staff planners realizing that American replacements exceeded German casualties, that American operations continued uninterrupted while German forces exhausted themselves, that the mathematics of attrition had become so unfavorable that defeat was certain. Most fundamentally, it was understanding that America had built a military system so different from European models that conventional military wisdom provided little guidance, that industrial economy had been weaponized in ways that made traditional measures of military effectiveness obsolete, and that Germany faced an opponent that could afford to spend lavishly in lives, material, and time because its resources were so vast that even prodigal expenditure barely diminished them.